All right, so some quick tips and follow-ups on that. Okay, so again, I would suggest that when you do a migration, you just log a support call with Microsoft just to let them know you're migrating data. They still say you don't need this, but it's a good idea to let them know there's a lot of volume of traffic potentially coming into the tenant so they don't throttle that. Start with small mailboxes that you can confirm the process works basically, all the way through, and beware that you may need to reconfigure OSTs. So if you have users with big OSTs that want to keep big OSTs, they would need to be recreated over that bandwidth. There are some 50 gig limits on some plans, so just watch out for that if you have mailboxes that are near that limit, and also look out for permissions on, where you've got the PA who's got rights into a manager's mailbox or whatever. So again, make sure you suss all those out beforehand. And because Microsoft 365 Business Premium comes with litigation hold, enable that as soon as possible. And obviously turn off old protocols like POP and IMAP as well. So let us talk about files and file migrations. SharePoint is not the hammer to solve the file problem or to create an intranet. The idea these days is you need to, excuse me. Excuse me, sorry about that. You need to think about a collaboration environment, not just a place to dump files. All right, so that means using Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, the whole range of options that are basically available to you. Now, this requires a different approach, as I've talked about. So the way to think about this and explain it to your customers is we have sort of an old and new and a modern world. So the old world is about pens and papers, calling and leaving a voicemail, going to the office, having, a single mailbox. And the reality there is that users get fed up with this. They can't do what they want. They can't collaborate. They see consumer-based tools doing better. So they go out and start using that, and that becomes shadow IT. So along comes Office 365, and it has a lot of these features, shared mailboxes, calendars. It's got files for personal and shared, and it's got the ability to do chat and projects and tasks, and that's really good. But the challenge there is you still need to set up, or someone needs to set up SharePoint sites, configure it, do the training, document libraries. And again, if users can't do that, they go back to using good old shadow IT. So the idea is that the Teams approach, the modern approach, is that when you create a team, you get all these capabilities out of the box, even if you don't need it. So when you create a team, you get an email address or a shared email box, you get, announcements, you get Planner, you get all of these capabilities to allow users to collaborate. So remember that the default arrangement in this new world is about collaboration first, right? It's always going to be about collaboration, allowing people to get their job done, right? That's the primary focus of Microsoft with all these tools, because they want people to see the value in them and buy, more tools. So this means that control shifts from being under the IT admin is, no, you can't, we have to do permissions to this, to by default, any user can create a team. Any user can configure all this stuff. Is that a good or a bad thing? Maybe. It's interesting to have a think about, but it is the way that it is out of the box now. The data shifts from being very structured, folders upon folders upon folders, into basically it's everywhere. Now, is that a problem? Probably not, because in today's world, it's all about search. If I can find information using search, does structure really matter? Probably not so much. Okay, so again, think about how people find information today on the internet. They don't care about what server it's on. They do a search, click on a link, and wherever that server is, wherever that information is, they go to it. They don't care whereabouts in the world it is or what server it is. They just want the information. So again, we see the same thing happening internally. And again, the access moves from being very linear, right? So think about how people work with their mailbox, right? So most people work with their mailbox is they go into their mailbox and they work from the top to the bottom, and then they work from the top to the bottom, and then they cycle through this linear list of tasks, which is their email box. Well, think about the difference with social media. People bounce between LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and all of these sort of things all over the time, looking at different feeds. They're looking at different users, they're following different people. So again, in this modern world, it's all about parallel information. You have to be able to absorb multiple streams of information, right? The world is not ruled by email anymore. You are not going to get all the information you need via email. Right, you have to be comfortable with getting information from other locations, typically from places like social media, which again is going to be a fire hose. But you need to learn to use the tool productively, and it is a very productive tool. But you do need to know and learn and train yourself on how to use it. So as I talked about before, the one constant in this world is change, right? Therefore, we need to build systems going forward that can be easily changed. Now, the problem with a very deep structure is that it's not very flexible to change. So if you create a SharePoint site and a sub-site and another sub-site, changing that around is very difficult, as it would be a directory structure. So therefore, the best practice these days is a flat structure, right? A completely flat structure. So instead of going deep, you create another document library. Instead of going deep, you create another team. So again, the best practice is a flat structure, right? You really should aim for a depth of no more than 3 levels. So the team is one, the channel is another, and then one folder below that area is really as deep as you want to go as a best practice. Can you go deeper? Absolutely. No question whatsoever. Okay, but you should be aiming for a very flat structure, which will give you the most flexibility and work best with the tools. Now, there is no right answer here. There is no do this and it works every time. It's always going to be a case of a customized solution. You've got parameters, you've got processes, you've got recommendations and best practices, which I can give you. But at the end of the day, each one of these is going to be a unique puzzle that requires somebody to solve it. But again, think about how you solve a jigsaw. Nobody, takes a piece out of the box and says, right, I'll start with this piece, then spends the rest of their time looking for another piece to connect to that one piece they've selected. Nobody ever does that. They tip all the pieces out, spread them out so they can see them. Then they look for the easy low-hanging fruit, which are the edge pieces, the corners. Oh, I recognize that. Let me start there. Then they find the next one. Then they'll go off and build another corner. So again, this is not a linear process. The idea here is to have these base tools and capabilities and approaches, but then this is the value add you as a reseller bring as an experienced operator to put this puzzle together using a method which obviously works for the customer. And that is not taking the one piece and following that to the next piece that you'll just take forever. So again, what's the easiest low-hanging fruit approach that you can take to all of this? Now, the other appreciation here is to understand is this is a journey. When you move house, you do not move into a structure which is identical to the one you left. There are different rooms, different sizes. The furniture goes in different places. The bathroom's in a different place. You throw stuff out, you buy new stuff. It's never a one-for-one migration, never a one-for-one move. Same thing when you move from a file server, same thing when you move anything. So the idea is to divide the data up and say, this stuff we're going to throw out, this stuff we're going to archive, this stuff is what gets moved, and some of it will be moved into new locations. Yes, it's about change. Yes, change is difficult, but to get the most out of the tool, you don't just drag and drop. You just don't take your whole garage full of junk and put it into the new garage when you move in. Right, it just doesn't work like that. You just don't get the efficiencies and the value if you do it that way. So one of the ways I like to think about it is to think about levels. So at the bottom level, you've got OneDrive for Business, then you've got Teams, then you've got SharePoint sites, communication sites, and so on, all the way out to something like Yammer. Now, if you look at it, most people spend most of their time creating at the lower levels in OneDrive, Teams, and so on. That's where they actually create and build documents, okay? Now, as we move out, the audience gets bigger. So OneDrive is your personal folder. Your team is a select group of people that you know and work with. SharePoint is a bigger audience. So therefore, information is largely going to flow from the inner layers to the outer layers. Right? That's how you want the information to flow, and that's the way the system is designed really to get the most value out of the data. Okay. So again, if we talk about this before, in that diagram I showed you prior to the break, I talked about control data and access. Remember, we talked about moving from the user's controlled data to the business controlled data. So again, at the OneDrive for Business, the user can create whatever data in whatever structure they want, don't care. That's their own little area. But once the data gets into SharePoint or in Teams, yes, I do care. It needs to be in a structure which suits everybody in the business, not the individual. Okay. And then the idea is that when we get to the intranet, we want it in a structured way which makes sense for everybody, because they're going to access it in a standard way. So your intranet, your SharePoint, your common areas are going to be far more structured and look more like a file server. But at the personal level, who cares? As long as the user's data is saved within their OneDrive for Business, it's always recoverable. And as a business, you will always have access to it. So the business can be compliant, it can have access to the data, the user can get to it on their mobile device or any other device that they so choose. So it's a matter of understanding what is the best place for the data. Because as I said, the idea is the data flows from OneDrive to Teams, and then from Teams to a SharePoint site, then to a communication site, and so up through the chain. So another way to think of this is you create a document at home. So you create your budget, you start working the budget, you save that budget in your OneDrive for Business, and that's personal to you until you get it to a point where you want to share it with the members of your team, you know, the finance committee or the finance people. And they then look at it, add value, they then approve it, they then, you know, do what they need to do. And then once that's finished, they then publish it to the whole community. So now the whole business can now look at the budget. The budget's finished. It's been published to the library for the widest audience and will largely not be changed from that point going forward. Now, if you turn it around and say, right, what about consuming data? Well, I would take a form, like a leave request form or something from that document library that is created by the HR people. I would then take that into my OneDrive. I would then edit it, change it, update it, and then push it to my team, which probably contains my manager, to then have it approved. So again, the flow is very similar. It may start at a different place, but the idea is you have all these capabilities and all these repositories available to you that provide important functionality, and you get the most out of it using it that way. And that's the value add you as a reseller can provide by guiding the customer, training them, helping them understand this is how they get the most value out of that information. Now, the idea here is that the data can be structured. The belt and suspenders brigade are happy because they can put it in a folder structure if you want, but it still can support this ad hoc capability, because at the end of the day, it's all available via search. Right, search is the absolute killer app. So if we go in and we have a look at, you know, OneDrive for Business, there's search. If we go into SharePoint, so if we go into SharePoint, up the top here, you'll see search, right? So there's the search banner there. If I go into, you know, Teams, there will be the search again, you know, up the top here when it initializes it. So this is an opportunity for you to go in and show the customer the value of putting stuff in this environment. The big killer app is going to be around, I might not like my team, but the idea is you've got search everywhere. So again, make sure you call this out and make sure the customer understands this is where they can go and put their finger on any piece of information that is in there. All right, so search is the absolute killer app. Now, in rough terms, again, rough terms, you would take a folder, right, that's on the server. These are all the repositories in which you can put information in Microsoft 365. You would then firstly clean that folder up. You'd throw away stuff that we talked about. You'd archive what makes sense. So you do a filter first. Then with what's left, you would move the first set of data to OneDrive for Business. Now, what's that going to be? The user's desktop files, home files, their profiles, all that sort of stuff goes into OneDrive for Business. Okay, quick and easy, job done, moved, and you would get the users to move it themselves. Now look at the user moving their data not as a task, look at it as a training exercise. So have you ever taught the users how to move data into OneDrive, to create a file, to delete a file, to recover a file, to use the recycle bin, to do all that sort of stuff? Has that training taken place? Because if you do that, then it's going to make the user more resilient. They're going to be able to self-solve their own problems generally, and they're going to be more, they're going to be happier because they're independent. Okay, so again, this is the value of training, showing them all the capabilities, right? Like restoring information is really straightforward to do. Then the next move is, okay, what needs to go into Teams? Now, the challenge with Teams is going to be why you can't move there first is because someone needs to decide what's the team going to be called? How many channels does it have? What's the securities? How are we going to manage this? So the idea for me is with files is I can walk into a customer and I can get them to start migrating and using OneDrive on day one. I can't do Teams on day one because there has to be decisions made about the structure. And that's, again, where the consulting, where the value add comes in. Now, after that, you've got the ability to do SharePoint standalone sites. They could be an archive or an extranet. So you may want to share files externally with a group of users. An extranet, a dedicated extranet is a good idea. So when do you create a SharePoint site versus team? Well, SharePoint is for storage. Teams is for storage and chat. So if there's any chance that your data will need chat or conversations around it, create a team. If it's just somewhere that's going to be for storing files, for consumption, viewing, or uploading, then again, your best option is a standalone team site. Now, on top of that, you can build a corporate-wide intranet, which is a communication site. That's effectively a pretty SharePoint site. And then on top of that is a hub site for navigation. And again, the idea there is you can also build Yammer for dedicated chat. Now, my approach is to always do OneDrive and Yammer first. The reason is because most organizations have never seen or experienced the benefit of enterprise chat, the ability to share information in a forum rather than do it inside an email. Now, the benefit of doing it in chat is it's searchable and it's much easier to find and do get information out publicly. So 90% or 95% of the emails you have in your inbox would probably have value to somebody else inside your organization, but because they're siloed in your inbox, no one else will ever see those. The idea with Yammer and those sort of tools and teams is to get the information out into a place that it can be shared and searched by others. Now, the idea here is you can use any or all of these. So I like to start with Yammer because I teach people how to use chat in isolation. And I start with OneDrive because I teach them files in isolation. Then when they come to use Teams, they're already familiar with chat. They're already familiar with file usage. So Teams is a piece of cake. But if you introduce Teams initially, you've got to teach them file management, you've got to teach them chat, you've got to teach them video conferencing. That's a lot for a user to digest, especially when they're moving from an old system. So again, my process, my approach is always one thing at a time. We do OneDrive first, get used to the files. We do Yammer next, they get used to chat, then we do Teams. Now, over time, Yammer would probably fall away, okay? They may not use it as much. But again, it's there as a training mechanism to get them familiar with the new way of working. And I still like using Yammer for company-wide chat. So Teams is chat within a group. So the admin people chat about admin stuff. The HR people talk about HR stuff in their team. And Yammer is reserved for company-wide conversations like what's happening in the market, what's the competition, social conversations, the water cooler style stuff. Now, as I said, you can use all, none of this, but my approach, this is the framework that I take to every single business that I talk about or work with when it comes to migration. And then we can map each location to what makes sense for that organization. And I can walk out of that door with them using OneDrive and Yammer immediately. So they've got a result for their investment by the time I've walked out the door. So that's why I like to basically use that approach. So a quick example here of moving an F drive to Microsoft 365. So you would have, a folder called sales, then customers, and then dates. Right. So the idea is that sales would become a team. All right. So there's a sales team. Inside the sales team, you would then basically create a channel called customers. All right. So the sales team could have all sorts of stuff. But one of those channels will be customers. And then inside that channel would be two folders called 2018 and 2019. So that's just a quick and simple example. Okay. So the idea then is I can go into it and I can tag the data even further. But I want to aim to keep that information as flat as possible. Right? I want to make it as easy for people to see information natively. I don't want them to have to dig deep through folder structures to find what they want. This makes it easier to move and repurpose if I need to adjust it. So again, just a best practice. This for me works everywhere I've been. It's the most flexible, but it is different from the approach that most people take with file servers. Okay, but that is my best practice recommendation for you. So as I mentioned, log a support call with Microsoft if you're going to start moving lots of data into your tenant so they know. Lots of free and paid migration tools are out there that do files as well. I would start with the department that's most tech savvy. So I've worked with organizations where the marketing department were the switched on people. They wanted to do all this and they were prepared to do a bit of learning, a bit of beta testing, and that really worked well. And then that drove adoption for all the other people inside the organization. And like I said, take the Cortez approach. It's like you move it, you don't copy it, right? Don't leave a source, right? Remove the source because otherwise people will keep going back to it and you'll get confused. There are 2 or 3 illegal file characters left these days. Most good third-party migration tools will pick this up for you and automatically make a change, including the Microsoft tools. They're very rare. But you may see them. So again, just be aware of those, but good tools will pick this up for you. And again, just watch out for your creation times and dates because when you move into a new location, you'll probably get a new timestamp on there depending on the tool that you use. And make sure that your regional settings are correct before you plow lots of stuff in there. So just make sure that the tenant is set for Australia. All right, so make sure the regional settings are appropriate. All right, with that, are there any questions about file migrations before we move on to the next topic? All right, well, I don't see any questions there, so let's keep moving along through the material. So my advice is that you should be implementing Azure immediately. So the thinking behind this is that you get an Active Directory free when you set up Microsoft 365, and you should add a paid subscription into that at the point of, the starting point. Now, the reason is that down the track, you'll be wanting to add paid services from Azure. So we will talk about some of these later on. So you may want to add Azure Backup, you may want to add Azure Storage, you may want to add Azure Sentinel, you may want to add virtual machines, or a whole range of other options that are available to you in Azure. The good thing here is if you add an Azure subscription into an Azure tenant, you are not charged until Azure services are in use. So putting an Azure subscription in immediately, right, is going to make life so much easier because it's already there, ready to go. It doesn't cost you anything to do this, but you're ready to set up these services to take advantage of out of the box. So one of the ones I'll talk about and recommend is Azure DNS. You can have all the DNS records for your customer inside Azure. The benefit of that is that you get the ability to do that programmatically. You can use PowerShell to implement things like DNS quickly and easily on an automated basis. And you also get better reporting, better insights because they're inside the Azure environment. So again, lots of benefits of doing this. Now, Azure DNS will cost you $2 or $3 a month. So again, having an environment where you can do that quickly and easily, to me, makes a lot of sense. So you'll see a lot of the Azure services we'll talk about in more detail over our time. But my advice would be is, again, when you implement any Microsoft 365 environment, always push an Azure subscription in there at the same time so it's done. There will be no cost to you or to the customer until you start consuming Azure services. And if you look at Azure services, you get the traditional infrastructure services such as virtual machines, networking, storage, firewalls, all that sort of stuff. But the real value add is the stuff on top, is the platform as a service. So again, things like backup, site recovery, Azure functions, automation, security, and so on. So again, think about the value add that you're providing by just selling, if you're just selling licenses, versus the ability to provide custom solutions around Azure. So you can now add additional value to environments for customers by implementing services built on Azure. And as you can see, there are thousands of those services that you can then roll out on that standard platform. All right, so don't just think that your opportunity starts and finishes with Microsoft 365 Business Premium or E5. Look at it in totality around adding value from additional services in Azure. Okay. So Raymond's asking a question about setting up SharePoint. I sort of showed you what SharePoint is. Okay, so the reality is you have a very flat structure, and you have the permissions as far up the structure as you can. So the permissions at the site collection or the document library level. You don't want to go into folders and files within that, much like a file system. So security is very much like a on-prem file server, but best practice is always have the security done at far up the tree as possible, at the site collection level or at the document library level. You don't want to go below that. You can, but you don't want to. Okay, so some takeaways on all of this migration stuff is keep it simple, right? What's your process? Yes, there's going to be variation, but you should be going through a repeating process. Go talk to your customer. What's the structure? How do we going to implement? Let's do OneDrive first, then let's do this, then let's do this. What's the rollout? How long does it take? Like I've got a whole, timetable that starts from, the day the customer, signs off on Office 365. As soon as they start that process, they're going to get emails, their users are going to get training videos, even before a speck of my data has been migrated to their environment. They get on a path of known steps. And then at day 0, then this will be implemented, then this will be implemented, and this will be done at day 10, this will be done at day 20. All of that can be completely automated. So again, that's the aim, that's the process that you want to be able to be aiming for. So you get this consistent approach. Right, and like I said, it's all down to creating stages and using checklists. That's how you get consistency. All right, it sounds boring, and it is, but that's how you get consistency. You get the same result every time, which is what you want. And consistency is the key. Right, so many installations I've seen is just inconsistent. Teams not called the same thing, no naming convention, permissions that aren't consistent. Again, consistency is what it's all about. It's going to make a much cleaner, much more manageable environment if you can keep it consistent. And as I mentioned, it's not just about SharePoint. Today, it's about Teams, it's about Yammer, it's about Sway, it's about, Planner. There's a whole range of tools there. And your customer's paying for those, and you should be enabling all of those tools in the environment, and there's your opportunity. If you're simply moving data and then moving to another job, then you're losing all the revenue opportunity, and you're creating a potential threat, allowing somebody else to come in and show them Power BI, to show them Delve, to show them Planner, to show them all these cool tools, which is what they really want. Okay, and don't overlook the mobility requirements. So again, how many people out there install the mobile apps for the customers, for Teams, for lists, for Delve, for, do you install all the mobile applications of all of these for your customers as well and show them how to use them and make the most of it? How many people have talked to their customers about things like Office Lens, where it will take a picture and OCR it for you, create it for a PDF, or take a picture of a whiteboard and make that available. Okay, there are just so many capabilities in here that you can build an offering around and go to market and differentiate yourself from every other person out there who's generally just moving data. Okay, and the good thing about all of this, and this is what I struggle to understand with many resellers, is they just want to close the ticket. They want to get the job done and then move on to another job. These aren't close the ticket events. These are consulting gigs. This is about working with the client and helping get the most of the tools for their needs. And that is going to change over time as they mature with the product. That means going back and changing the structure. That means going back and creating teams when it was SharePoint sites. But so many traditional MSPs I see that come from an infrastructure background simply want to close the ticket so that they can say they kept their KPIs and then move on to the next, regardless of the revenue opportunities they leave on the table. So the world is moving to, like I said, this concept of consulting, not tickets. Now, if you want to stay in the traditional MSP world and close tickets and whatever, that's great, but you are going to be in a commodity market that will be outsourced and driven to zero. The big opportunity is around consulting, services, value add, optimizing and helping the client use the tools, not doing the basic jobs like fixing keyboards and remoting into machines to fix some printer error. Right? There's simply not the value, especially the smaller you are. If that's your business model, you're really going to struggle. The profitability is not going to be there. But you can be a one-man band and focus on something like Power BI or Dynamics or CRM, and you can make more money than a very large organization, or you can make more profit than a larger organization who is focused purely on commodity, close the ticket, old world infrastructure items. But the choice is yours. The opportunity is there. Okay. But think about it as consulting rather than pure ticket closing. So you are going to need, your organization is going to need to understand Azure AD. Again, I find a lot of people still struggle with the concept of an identity provider. Okay, where is the identity? How is it managed? Is it on-prem and synchronized? Is it ADFS? Is it federated? What's the difference between NTLM credentials and SAML credentials? A lot of people still don't understand this in depth. So my advice to you is make sure that you have a very good grounding and understanding of what Azure AD actually is. PowerShell is the number one tool that you can use to automate all of this, right? It is just, phenomenal what can be achieved with this environment. So as a quick demo, we'll talk about this in more detail. But one of the things that I do is when I go into any organization or do any sort of troubleshooting, the first thing I want to do is go in and basically look at their DNS, right? So what I've done here is written a DNS script, which will basically .com.au, that will basically go in and suck out all the DNS records for me and display them on screen, but also give me a CSV output. Now, sure, there are third-party tools out there that will do it, but I use PowerShell to do it. It's quick and easy, and I've got full control of this tool. You'll see here that, for example, this domain here has got an SPF, has got a DMARC, and has also got DKIM enabled. So that's going to give me additional information when I'm working with customers or when I'm troubleshooting issues. So I cannot stress how important it is to have some sort of PowerShell skills out there these days. SharePoint, understanding permissions, understanding folder structures, understanding site collections. It is the file management tool these days. It really is. You need to have a good understanding of how to create files, delete files, restore files, version control files, check-in files, check-out files. Right. SharePoint's been with us since the year 2000, and still there is a lack of knowledge there. So, Teams file storage is built on SharePoint. OneDrive for Business is built on SharePoint. SharePoint is one of the key technologies in the Microsoft stack. They might not call it SharePoint, but anything that manages files is effectively SharePoint, and therefore knowledge on that is going to be a benefit to you. And obviously Intune Endpoint Manager to push out the policies to manage security, managing Windows 365, all of that stuff is now done by Endpoint Manager. So understanding how that works in lieu of things like group policy, again, are super critical skills. So any business today which is looking after cloud technologies at a minimum needs to be familiar with Azure AD, PowerShell, SharePoint, and Intune in my books. So again, invest the time learning that if you aren't already comfortable there. So some resources for you. Get the slides after the fact. Those normal resources there from me. But before we move on to our next topic du jour, are there any questions on any of that? Any other questions on any of that? All right, I don't see any questions coming in. I think that's probably a good excuse to look at setting up our regular 10-minute break. All right, so I don't see any coming through, so let me end the recording.